If you're ready to move beyond the basics of editing inside of Lightroom, then you're in the right place. I've had this photo sitting on my hard drive for the last year, kind of waiting for the perfect opportunity for us to edit this together. So down in the description, you can actually download this photo and follow along as we go through some of the basics of editing inside of Lightroom, but then quickly move into some of the more advanced photo editing techniques and talk about some of the most powerful tools that Lightroom has to offer, so we can take a photo that looks like this and turn it into this. Inside of Lightroom, there are two tabs that you're gonna spend the majority of your time in, the Library tab and the Develop tab. So when you first open it up, you're looking at the Library tab where all of your photos are stored and where you also want to import photos, because we need to tell Lightroom where all the photos are stored on our hard drive. So let's click Import, and then we're gonna browse to wherever you have that photo that you downloaded. So if it's in your Pictures folder or if it's in your Documents folder, browse to it, select it, hit Import, and then when you've done that, hit Done. And then you'll want to find that folder inside of Lightroom, wherever it is, in this case, 2023, 2024, scroll to it, select it. Now that it's selected, it will show the histogram, and you also get these quick develop options. Now, if you were feeling a little bit lazy and maybe all you wanted to do was like automatic settings, or you wanted to just quickly adjust the exposure, you could come here, bump the exposure by like 1/3 of a stop or a full stop, or that probably looks terrible. So maybe in this case, I'll just hit auto and kind of let Lightroom decide. I don't know, how do we feel about that? Or I could also tell it white balance. I could say, you know, maybe this is like a shade, kind of like a colder white balance. And then that usually does a pretty good job of getting your photo to a starting point. But that is super basic. So we're not gonna do that. We're gonna reset all those settings. And then one more thing I wanna show you before we move on is the metadata panel. This is super handy if you wanna know what camera, what lens, or what settings you used. Now in this case, this was shot on the DJI Mini 4 Pro. It will also tell you the lens that you used or any other information. So sometimes that is super helpful. But let's get a little bit more advanced. Let's move it to the next level and move to the Develop tab. So this is where you're gonna see all the settings, all of your sliders, all of your adjustments. So we have the basic adjustments, which is exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows. We have a histogram at the top that tells us where all of the data is distributed inside of our photos. We have highlights on the right and shadows on the left. If we scroll down, we have one of those more advanced tools, the tone curve. We have color mixer, we have color grading, we have detail, which allows us to adjust sharpness. We're gonna get into all these, so don't freak out. I'm just kind of showing you where they are. Lens corrections by default is off, but I will usually turn it on just to correct any warping or distortion. We have transformation, which is helpful if you're doing like architecture, photography. We have lens blur, which is a little bit more of a creative tool, effects, and calibration. So that's what we're dealing with, but let's rewind it a bit back to the beginning, because we need to talk about choosing the right photo to edit. There are three things that I look for when I'm editing a photo. The first is the subject. In this case, I have a mountain in Iceland. That is an awesome subject to take a photo of and edit. The second is, what does the composition look like? Is it centered? Is it off-centered? In this case, I have the peak of the mountain right in the middle. I have the leading line of the shore that is kind of also directing you to look at this peak. I have these layers. I have this background mountain range. I have another mountain and then that other mountain. And I also have a shoreline in the foreground. Now this is a drone photo, so it's not like I could put something really close to the lens because I'm up in the air, but I have that foreground, I have that background, and I have that subject. But I also have good lighting. Now, because this was shot in Iceland in the winter, you kind of have perpetual golden hours, so the lighting looks good at any time of day, but the clouds look great. I have this really nice, soft color cast, but it's a little bit too blue. And so this is where we get into the basic adjustments. The first one I pretty much always make is my white balance. So immediately, I'm gonna grab this slider. You see if I move it to the right, it makes it warmer. Now I don't wanna go too warm because that's too much. I'm eliminating all the color. Ideally with white balance, what you wanna see is all those colors kind of becoming neutral. And if you look at the peaks on the histogram, this is the secret to doing your white balance manually. You can see I have these really harsh red, green, blue separations. But if I bring it back, slowly, those peaks start to overlap. If I go all the way in the other direction, same sort of thing, that's not gonna work. Somewhere around here, maybe around 7,000 is where I want my white balance to be. The rest of these adjustments, you can kind of think as fixing your mistakes. So exposure, if you've underexposed or overexposed, again, I'm gonna look at the histogram. I don't want too much on one side or too much on the other. Like if I overexposed this image, if it was too bright, you'd see I have a lot of peaking over here. Or if I underexpose the image, it'd be too dark and I have a lot of peaking on the shadow side of the histogram. So ideally, you can see I'm just clicking and dragging on the histogram, so that's kind of a little bit of a cheat code if you want a graphical way to adjust these sliders. And I kind of want to find a place that's in the middle. I would say I exposed it pretty well, but maybe just a little bit brighter so that I'm not crushing the shadows too much. But then you could come in and you could say, well, maybe I want to bring the highlights down. Maybe I want to bring the shadows up and adjust the specific portions of that histogram. So it's gonna depend on your specific image, but make those adjustments so you get the image to kind of like a neutral starting point. This next set of sliders is a little bit tricky. I don't like to touch them until we get into some of the more advanced editing techniques, but texture, clarity, dehaze are all ways to adjust contrast. So you may have noticed there's another contrast slider up at the top. I leave this alone because it kind of can destroy your image pretty quick. If you want to make some contrast adjustments at the end of your edit, I'd recommend maybe using that once you're done all the other edits that I'll show you. But for now, I'm gonna leave all these alone. I do like to give myself a little bit of starting saturation. So saturation boosts everything. You might be tempted to play with vibrance, which usually saturates the less saturated colors in your image. So if I start to boost this, you'll notice that those blues start to really pop. So you might want to toggle back and forth between vibrance and saturation to see which one works on your specific photo. Now that our photo is edited at a basic level, I like to have a little bit of fun and play with some presets to see what's possible. So I'll grab my Division 2 presets and just start scrolling through them to see, do I want a little bit more of like a stylized look? Do I want something that's warmer, that's cooler? Maybe my Thunderbird preset tends to make things look pretty good as a starting point, or do I just want something light? Rustic Dawn, Ranger Green kind of gives it this greenish tint. Nordic Tundra was actually a preset that I based off of some photos that I shot in Iceland. Same thing with Atlantic Highlands. So already, without having to do much more, these do look pretty good. White Cedar, maybe a little bit too washed out. So some of these look better than others. Obviously, it's gonna depend on the lighting that you shot in and the subject that you're shooting and all these other variables. So sometimes some presets will look better than others, but if you're interested in checking out any of my presets to kind of give yourself that one-click editing operation and then you're done, all of those will be linked down in the description. And actually, with my Lightroom presets, I think there's like an hour and a half of customized tutorials on how to use presets, how to install them, how to troubleshoot if you're having any issues. They work on desktop, on Mac, they work with any camera brand. You can even load them up onto your phone. And so usually when I'm out editing and I just want some quick edits to post to Instagram, I'll load the photos onto my phone, throw on a preset and basically post it without having to do much more. But we wanna do some more advanced edits. We wanna do all this ourselves. So let's jump in to the next set of panels. Up at the top, you may have noticed that I skipped over these smaller icons. There are two in particular that I want to focus on. I'm actually going to start with this little eraser, which is the remove tool. So if I click it, let's say there's something inside of my image that I want to get rid of or I want to clean up. Maybe this little piece of water ice right here. Well, there are three options. There is the remove, there is the heal, and then there is the clone. Typically, I will use remove unless I'm trying to copy specific pixels, in which case you could also use the clone. But the remove is gonna work in 90% of scenarios. And all you do is you can change your brush size by rolling your mouse wheel or hitting the square brackets on your keyboard, and then just slowly brush over whatever it is that you wanna remove. And in 2 seconds, it's gone. Now, there are some crazy AI features built into Lightroom now. So if you want to use a more advanced editing technique, you can use generative AI. You can have it detect and find the edges of subjects. And then after you've done all of those, you can hit close and it brings you back to what the photo looks like. The next tab is the masking tab, which is super powerful. So this is where we're gonna get into some of those advanced techniques and start to make some localized adjustments. In my case, this photo looks pretty good, but I do want to highlight the mountains a little bit more than they're highlighted already. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to select an object and I'm gonna make my brush nice and big, and I'm just going to brush over this entire mountain range. I'm not gonna be careful. I'm just gonna be rough with it. Let's see what it selects. Okay, so it actually did a pretty good job. It missed a portion up here. If I wanted to select those missing portions, I could say add to the mask and I could do another object select, or I could grab something like a brush and do a little bit of a manual brush. And if I wanted to make sure I was finding the edges of this mountain peak, I could actually make sure auto mask is selected. And then as I start to brush, you can see it will try to find the edge of the object. And if it's not doing it fast enough or intense enough, you can actually increase the flow. So now you'll see that the brush starts to get heavy. Of course, you can also turn auto mask off to make sure you've got all those little pieces in. But what I want to do here is add some additional texture and contrast to my mountain range. So I'm actually gonna go down to some of those settings that we skipped earlier, clarity and texture. So I'm gonna grab the clarity and you're gonna see what this is gonna do. So that is gonna kind of give like it does a little bit of automatic detection in the background and tries to add like this localized contrast to medium frequency textures, if that makes any sense. Texture is high frequency texture. So like really fine detail things like the grass that we have at the bottom, or like the rocks that we have, or like all this like micro texture. So if I start to drag texture, you can see it really starts to increase that. Now, if I did dehaze, dehaze is low frequency, so big objects. So if we had some mist that was covering this scene and we just wanted to like demist it or dehaze it, hence the name, we could just go dehaze and it kind of adds a little bit more contrast back into those details. But I think probably fine default, maybe a little bit extra. The other thing I'm gonna do is add a little bit of sharpness. Actually, I'm gonna zoom in so that you can see what this is doing. If I add too much sharpness, it starts to go crazy. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to just give it a little bit of sharpness just to get more edge detail out of the portions of my image that I really want to stand out. Another mask that I like to add is a dodging and burning mask, where we kind of alter the localized exposure in areas where we either want more definition or maybe we want a little bit less definition. So if I take a look at this and I zoom into my mountain peak, I'm going to create a new brush and I'm going to burn or drop the exposure. And then without auto mask and maybe like a medium amount of flow, I'm just gonna start brushing over areas of this image that I want to be a little bit darker. So if I zoom out and then I turn that mask on and off, you can see it's kind of creating this effect as if the lighting or the shadows were a little bit more intense. And it really helps those peaks and those ridges on this mountain range pop. You can also do the opposite and create another brush and then do a plus exposure and then brush over areas of your image where you maybe want things to be a little bit more defined or a little bit brighter, such as the areas of the snow or maybe the peak of the mountain where there might be a little bit more light catching. And if you happen to have lost track of the areas that you've brushed, if you hit O on the keyboard, it will highlight it in an overlay in red so that you can go back and maybe do some touch-ups. Like you can go to the erase tool over here and then start to remove areas, or you can actually go to this mask and say subtract and do another brush and remove the areas that you no longer want to see. Another mask that I'm gonna add is a foreground vignette. So I'm gonna do a linear mask and just drag it over the foreground here. And what I'm gonna do is say negative exposure. And the idea is that I really want to emphasize that subject, that centralized mountain peak. And so by doing a vignette and darkening the foreground, I'm kind of telling the viewer, look this way. Don't pay attention to the shoreline, although it's there and it's part of my foreground. Really look towards the main subject of this photo. And then I'm gonna do another brush with a positive exposure and a positive clarity, and then start brushing over some of these white caps, like these waves here, because I would like them to stand out and be a little bit brighter than they are. Usually I don't do too much to the sky, but there is a automatic sky mask that you can create that usually does a pretty good job of like AI detecting the sky. And in this case, I think I'm gonna drop the exposure just a little bit, because usually when you drop the exposure, you start to bring some of that color back. But you could also just drop the highlights if you're trying to bring more color back to those white areas. Or if you wanted to make the clouds pop a little bit, you could use a dehaze and just dehaze it to really make them stand out. But you kind of got to be careful with this because it starts to make it look a little bit too artificial. So sometimes just a little bit is all you need. And then one technique I like to do is kind of create this like blooming diffusion effect, if you want to call it that. So I'm going to do a radial gradient and then kind of place it in the direction that my light source is coming from. So my light source is actually slightly behind and to the left of the drone. And I'll do this a few ways. So sometimes I'll just do like a little bit of a positive exposure to kind of fake the direction of light. I'll also sometimes use a negative dehaze. So the negative dehaze kind of like washes out and de-emphasizes that corner. But because it's golden hour and the sun would be that warmer color, I'll also do a little bit of like a warmer color temperature. And that adds a really nice, like kind of like fade effect from the side. You can kind of just move that around and place it exactly where you want it to be. Moving beyond the basics into more of those advanced photo editing techniques, we have the tone curve. Now the tone curve is a little bit intimidating at first, but what it is a chart or a graph of all of the tonal information inside of your image. So on the left side, we have blacks or dark tones. On the right, we have bright tones. So if I just click and drag a point up, it will brighten or increase the value of those tones. If I drag it down, it will decrease them. Now, if I left that middle point there, and let's say I want the darkest tones of my image to be darker, well, I could go back to the curve and then put another point and then start to drag the shadows down. So it's making my dark tones darker. Likewise, I can grab the bright tones that are over here and make those white tones or those highlights brighter. But this is a little bit too much, so I'm going to reset it. And if you're unsure of where the tonal information is inside of your image, you can actually click this little picker, which is another one of those kind of advanced tools that not everyone knows about. But if I click it and I say I can pin certain colors, meaning I can tell it leave it where it is, because I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna adjust it. So maybe I'm gonna pin the mountain because the mountain is perfect. It looks exactly the way I want it to. I could add a pin for the sky. In fact, this one, I'm gonna click and I'm gonna drag up. So as I drag it up, it makes those bright tones brighter. And then I could do the same thing for like this dark black sand beach. Click, drag down, and it is dragging directly on the tone curve without me having to guess where all of that information is. And in the same way, you can go into the red, the green, or the blue tone curve. So let's say I wanted more blue in this image. Well, if I click and I drag up, it will add more blue. If I drag down, it will add more yellow and make the image warmer. But I don't want to affect the whole image. Maybe I only want to affect the highlights. So again, I'm going to grab my little adjuster tool and I'm going to say, keep the dark tones, keep them dark. The mountain, I like the color. Keep it that color. Maybe the ocean over here, keep it that color. I want this area right here, this specific tonal value to be more yellow. So I can drag it down or I can drag it back up. That will make it blue. Dragging it down will make it yellow. So really quickly, you can start to do some color grading of this image, and we haven't even gotten to the color mixer or the color grading panel. But in order to show you what the color mixer and the color grading do, I'm actually going to reset this channel and then scroll down. And here we have a whole set of tools that specifically target each of these individual colors. So if I wanted blue to be less, I didn't want blue, I said no more blue, I can grab that little picker, and again, I can click on my image and drag down and start to remove blue. Or I can increase it, although increasing it probably doesn't look the way I want it to look. And I could also come in and adjust these manually. So if I wanted the oranges, those grass areas by the base of the mountain, to be more highlighted, more saturated, I could do that as well. Or if I want to change one color to another color, well, that's where the hue mixer comes into play. So if I wanted these orange areas to be more yellow, well, I could grab the orange and start to slide it towards yellow. That's looking a little bit unnatural, so sometimes you have to be careful and just make minor adjustments. Like maybe I want the blue to be more cyan, probably not. Looking a little bit too tropical for me. Likewise, I can go into luminance and start to play around, and maybe I want the blue areas to be brighter. Luminance equals brightness. So if I start to grab blue, you can see that all those areas will get brighter, but I have to be careful because what starts to happen is I get this banding effect in the areas where blue turns into purple. If for some reason you can't pick the exact color that you want, you can go into the point color, select this eyedrop, and then sample an area of your image. So let's say, for example, I did want to choose this orangey brownish color. Well, I could pick it, and then it allows me to refine it. So in this case, it's telling me the color that you've picked is right here. It is this orangey reddish color, and I could say, well, actually it's a little bit, I wanna select more of that orange, and I wanna select the full saturation range, all of that orange color. And then I could say, well, what do I wanna do? Do I wanna desaturate it? Do I wanna saturate it? So I can start playing with these adjustments. I could desaturate, I could resaturate, which is too much. I could do the same thing I did before, where I could, maybe make it red or maybe make it a little bit more green. In this case, I'm a big fan of keeping my landscapes looking the way that I remember them, or looking the way that they really should be looking. So I'm gonna delete this adjustment. And instead, let's look at color grading. So this is where you can really start to get creative and give your photo a unique look. So you have shadows, the dark black tones, you have mid-tones, kind of all those gray in-betweens, and then you have the highlights or the white tones. So the easiest in this case to visualize is probably gonna be the highlights. If I start saying, this area here, I want it to be, maybe I want it to be a little bit warmer, I could start to go like this, and you can see really quickly, it's giving me pink skies, which might be a little bit too much. So I can bring down the saturation, or if I want it to be brighter or darker, I can grab this little slider here and move it to the right, and it will increase the luminance, or move it to the left and decrease the luminance. And you can see by decreasing the luminance, it's actually given my photo a little bit more of like a pastel-y look, or a little bit of a flat look. If I grabbed the shadows and increased the luminance there, it's kind of the same effect. So some of those presets that I showed you earlier that had a little bit more of like a flat look had that lifted shadow and that flattened highlight, which allows you to bring more color into the photo, but then reduces some of that contrast and that tonality. So the opposite would be to grab the shadows and really crush them down, or grab the highlights and really bring them up, and now you have a very high contrast image, which is probably a bit too much. So ideally, you wanna find something in between that gives you that neutral look that is true to what the landscape, again, should actually look like. Depending on where your photo is gonna end up, you might wanna add a little bit of extra sharpness. So under detail, we have the sharpening adjustment, and I'll zoom in to an area of detail. And we already added a little bit of sharpness. This is kind of like the global overall sharpness for the entire image. So if I start to drag up the sharpness really quickly, it can add a whole bunch of like fake detail, like it's ultimately just sharpening the noise. So you kind of want to find a happy balance. And one way to do that is if you go to masking and you hold Alt on your keyboard and you kind of wait until you reach a point where it's highlighting the edges of objects. So the ridges of the mountain and then some of those extra rock textures. So probably somewhere right around there. And now if I drag the amount to 0 and start to drag it up, you won't notice it as much because it's not sharpening all those intermediate, those in-between areas. It's just sharpening the edges of those rocks or of the objects that are in your photo. Whenever I'm editing, I'll often go back and retouch the masks that I've already added, or even add more masks. In this case, I want to add a mask for this mountain range in the background because it's a little bit too blue, and I kind of want to reduce that blue without adjusting the blue in the rest of the image. So I'm going to go to Create Mask, and I'm going to say Create a Brush, and I'm going to keep my flow around the midpoint. I'm gonna make sure auto masking is turned off, and I'm gonna keep overlay on so that you can see where I'm brushing. And so really slowly, I'm just gonna start to brush in some of these areas here. And then within that mask, I actually have a whole set of separate color controls. So I have a point color, which I'm gonna say sample the point color, and I'm going to sample the color blue that is here, and I actually want to reduce it to make it match a little bit better. So let's see if I adjust the hue, desaturate it just a little bit. Do we need a little bit more luminance? So you might need to play with it to get it to match perfectly. But the idea is that if you don't want to make these massive global color adjustments and you just want to adjust the color of one thing, adding a mask and then going down to point color will allow you to do that. Depending on where you're sharing your photo, whether you're gonna print it or you're gonna share it on Instagram, you might actually wanna crop it. That icon is back at the top. It's this guy here. When you select it, this grid will show up and you have a bunch of preset options. So the Instagram crop is 4:5, but when you select it, you'll notice that it's the wrong way. So if you need to flip the direction of your crop, if you hit X on the keyboard, it will actually flip it. And if you need to set like a level horizon, you can either set the angle or you can drag this little tool and drag it across your horizon. But of course, in this case, we want to share this photo. So I'm going to go up to File, say Export. Now I have some presets in here that I've set up for various JPEG compression qualities, but usually the setting that I'm using is a 90% JPEG compression. So I'll go down and I'll show you so you can copy these settings for yourself, but I will use JPEG quality 90. So more quality means higher quality, but also bigger file sizes. So you might want to experiment a little bit. I find anything below 70 doesn't look too good, and 100 tends to be too big of a file size, so I'll usually leave it around 90. I don't really do anything extra. The DPI doesn't matter because this is gonna be posted onto Instagram or somewhere online, and I'm not gonna resize it. Sometimes I will resize for Instagram, and the Instagram dimensions, in case you're wondering, are 1080 wide by 1350. So you could do that, you could export that, and then you'd be ready to upload to Instagram. But I wanna know, did your photo edit turn out anything like mine? Or did you use a completely different color grading strategy? Or maybe you tweaked your tone curves in a different way. Or maybe instead of using my photo, you used your own photo. If you did, tag me over on Instagram, either on your stories or on a post, because I wanna see these edits. I wanna see what your photos look like and if you were able to use some of these more advanced photo editing techniques. If you weren't, because you don't have any photos of your own yet, well, you know what we say around here? We say, grab your camera, get out, and go shoot photos.